We are recording. I'm going to share my screen. One second here. All right, we're rolling. Here we are, session number 6, the church. You guys all do have in your calendar, right, that the 6th of June is the date that the bishop's coming for confirmation. Make sure you got that written down. So here we are talking about the church. You guys had a reading. Thought maybe a fun way to kind of start would be just to give things some context, a little historical context. We could just talk about the whole dang history of the church in 10 minutes. So I called my producer friends in Hollywood and put together this video. That's a joke, something I just found on the internet. Church history in 10 minutes. Enjoy.
Right, so what you need to know is how we get from Jesus here to the great big church, all the great big churches we have today. No problem. So, Jesus Christ, parables, miracles, love your enemies, death and resurrection, amazing. He had lots of followers, or disciples, but these 12 guys were specially chosen by Jesus, and he made Peter their leader. When Jesus went up to heaven, this lot, well, one was replaced, another story. This lot continued to spread Jesus' teaching, but not everyone was happy about it. The Romans, for a start, who'd already crucified Jesus and felt that should have been an end to it. And the Jewish authorities employed people like Saul here to stamp out the new religion. But then Saul had a vision and heard Jesus. Why are you giving me a hard time? What's your problem? So Saul changed his name to Paul and spent the rest of his life spreading the new religion instead. Paul and Peter and the rest of the 12 are known as the apostles, which is Greek for messengers. The people who believed the apostles' message began to meet together, and someone in Antioch came up with a nickname for them, Christians, because they followed Christ. Paul and Peter and a few others wrote letters to these groups of Christians, called churches, and you can read some of them in the Bible. Around about now, the first book about Jesus' life was written. It's called Mark, and you can read that in the Bible too. In the following 50 years or so, the books of Matthew, Luke, and John appeared, all with a slightly different take on Jesus' life. Most Christians believe that Peter became the very first bishop of Rome, a dangerous place to be. Fire destroyed most of the city, and rumours spread that the Emperor Nero had started it to clear the land for a massive palace. He needed someone else to blame, so he picked on the Christians. No one liked Christians. Everyone thought they were superstitious because they didn't follow the Roman religion, or even the Jewish one. They were probably criminals because their leader, Jesus, had been executed, and they were cannibals because they ate bodies and drank blood. They didn't. It was the bread and wine of the Lord's Supper, of course. All a misunderstanding, but the upshot was that thousands of Christians were persecuted and killed. Nero used them as human candles, and many more met gory deaths in the circus. Not that kind of circus, that kind of circus. Peter and Paul were probably executed around now. The story goes that Peter was crucified upside down and Paul was beheaded. The other apostles were all killed too, apart from John, who was the only one to die of old age. But Christianity continued to grow. The churches were run by bishops, and the first ones, along with other Christian thinkers of the time, are known as the Church Fathers. Most of them were killed as well. Right from the start, Christians argued about what to believe and how to behave. One of the Church Fathers, a man called Origen, even castrated himself because he wanted to live a pure life. But it didn't catch on. In Britain, Christianity probably arrived with Roman converts trying to escape the persecution. Some hope. One of the first British Christians we know about, a man called Alban, was beheaded for being a Christian. Then a general in the Roman army called Constantine became emperor, and he'd recently converted to Christianity. Or so he said. His story was that he'd had a vision of a Christian symbol called the Chi Rho, the first 2 letters of Christ in Greek. He heard the words, "By this sign, conquer," so he got his soldiers to paint it on their shields, beat anyone who fancied a fight, and became emperor. But his conversion might have been a crafty political move. Constantine wanted everyone to work together, but the Roman religion got in the way because different people worshipped different gods. He saw Christianity, a religion in which everyone worshipped the same god, as a good way to unite the empire. Little did he know how things would turn out. Constantine passed a law that allowed Christians freedom to worship without persecution. This meant that the bishops could get together to decide exactly what they all believed. They drew up the first draft of the Nicene Creed, a statement of their beliefs that churches still use today. This big bishopy get-together was called an ecumenical council, and there were 7 in all because the arguments went on and on, mainly about Jesus. Some people believed he was just a man, some people believed he was God and had disguised himself as a man, some people believed he was 2 beings, God and man in one body. The councils eventually decided that Jesus was totally God and totally man at the same time. Christianity was made the Roman Empire's official religion by the Emperor Theodosius, who also split the empire in 2. And despite the bishop's efforts to keep everyone together, the church was beginning to split up as well. The Nestorians left at the Council of Ephesus because they believed that Jesus was just a man and God's Spirit had come to live inside him. More people, known today as the Oriental Orthodox churches, left at the Council of Chalcedon. They didn't like the council's description of Jesus, of one substance with the Father and at the same time of one substance with man, because they thought it sounded too much like what the Nestorians had said. They also didn't like how powerful the Bishop of Rome was becoming. For a long time now, the Bishop of Rome, also called the Pope, had been gaining power, partly because he'd inherited the authority of the Apostle Peter, but mainly because those guys in Rome were really good at organising everyone. The Western Church and the Eastern Church were slowly drifting apart. They just didn't talk anymore. Most people in the West spoke Latin, and most people in the East spoke Greek, and the East didn't like having to do what the Pope said all the time, and then the West added some words to the Nicene Creed without asking the East. They were living separate lives. For a while, the Eastern Church was more powerful than the West, which had to cope with marauding Vandals, the fall of the Roman Empire, and the Dark Ages. By the time the West had sorted itself out, the East had challenges of its own as a new religion called Islam spread out from Arabia. In the West, Charlemagne was now ruling, well, most of it. He gave himself the title Holy Roman Emperor and got the Pope to crown him. This gave the Pope even more power, because from now on you couldn't be emperor unless the Pope said so. Finally, it happened. The Great Schism. The church split in 2, the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East, obviously, and the Roman Catholic Church in the West. The Roman Catholic Church became more and more powerful, while the Eastern Orthodox Church began to feel more and more squeezed out by the rise of Islam. This is where the Crusades come in. The Pope sent thousands of soldiers to the East to claim Jerusalem for Christianity, but the so-called Crusaders left a trail of destruction across Europe before they got anywhere near a battlefield. The Muslim leaders fought back, and over the next 150 years there were 6 more big crusades while the 2 sides struggled for control of the Holy Land. Eventually, the Crusaders gave up and went home. But the fact that the Pope now had the power to send soldiers to war shows that something somewhere had gone very wrong. Even your local priests were getting too big for their boots. Church services were in Latin, and the Bible had been translated into Latin, but by now only educated people like priests could understand Latin, so everyone else had to trust that what they said the Bible said was what the Bible really said. Some priests had seen an opportunity here, and had started to charge people to forgive their sins, placing themselves firmly between God and everyone else like holy bouncers. A professor at Oxford University called John Wycliffe argued that it was time for the church to clean up its act, to be reformed. He translated the Bible into English so that everyone could read it for themselves and make up their own minds. It didn't go down well with those in charge, and his Bibles were burnt. It took a long time for an actual Reformation to kick off, but eventually a German priest called Martin Luther wrote a list of 95 theses, things he thought were wrong with the church, and nailed them to the door of an actual church in Wittenberg. The Pope sacked him, which Luther didn't mind because priests couldn't get married, and if he wasn't a priest anymore... A group of nuns had written him some fan mail, so he smuggled them out of their convent in herring barrels and married one of them after she'd had a long bar. The people who protested against the church and its teachings became known as Protestants. Other big names included John Calvin in France and Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland. But they argued forever about what to believe instead, so very soon there were different groups of Protestants protesting. England remained officially Roman Catholic, and it was dangerous to be anything else. William Tyndale made himself so unpopular with his Protestant ideas that he had to leave the country. He translated the New Testament into English, and copies were smuggled back home to help Protestant feelings grow. Then King Henry VIII decided to marry Anne Boleyn, but he was already married to Catherine of Aragon. Divorce was out of the question back then, so Henry asked the Pope to annul his marriage instead, which would mean that the marriage had never been a real marriage in the first place. The Pope said no, but Henry had met a friendly English priest called Thomas Cranmer and made him Archbishop of Canterbury, so Thomas was more than happy to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine and marry him off to Anne. The Pope was very cross, so Henry left the Roman Catholic Church and made himself head of a new Church of England. The Roman Catholics realised they had to do something before everyone became a Protestant, and so the Counter-Reformation began. Catholic bishops got together for the Council of Trent, where they decided to keep their traditions, but made rules to stop priests conning people out of their hard-earned cash. The Church of England was still very like the Roman Catholic Church, just without the Pope. But when Henry died, his 9-year-old son became King Edward VI, and he allowed Thomas Cranmer to make the Church of England more Protestant. Cranmer wrote a list of 39 articles, which spelt out what the Church stood for, and stands for today, and wrote the Book of Common Prayer, which some churches still use. But the fiercely Roman Catholic Queen Mary I reunited England with the Pope and had lots of Protestants burned at the stake, including our friend Thomas Cranmer, earning herself the nickname Bloody Mary. Then Mary died, Elizabeth I became Queen, and she made England Protestant again. Next came James I, who was the first monarch of England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. He was a big fan of Protestantism and even published his own translation of the Bible. As European empires spread throughout the world, so did Christianity, and churches sent out missionaries to convert people in those hard-to-reach places. The Protestants continued to, protest, and there have been various offshoots over the years, from churches like the Quakers and Methodists, who have fairly mainstream beliefs, to groups like the Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ, known as Mormons, and the Jehovah's Witnesses, who have more distinct beliefs of their own. In 1962, the Roman Catholic Church held a council, known as the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, which brought in some big changes. Church services, which had always been in Latin, were now to be in the language of the people. And so we continue to the present day, with churches of all different kinds all over the place. The Eastern Orthodox Church, the Oriental Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and ever-increasing numbers of Protestant churches, Lutherans, Calvinists, the Church of England, Methodists, Quakers, Baptists, United Church, Pentecostals. You have to wonder what Jesus would say about it all.
Yay! So there's a little bit of a backdrop of the sweeping breadth of church history. Any questions about any of the particulars? We want to talk more about the theology of the church today than the history of the church, but I thought the history gave a bit of a context to what we're talking about, like why there are so many denominations and so forth. Any comments or questions?
I thought it was an interesting video. I feel like I learned a few things.
I like the narrator. I like how she says missionaries instead of missionaries. It's kind, it's cute. It's a cute English thing. Well, okay. If there's no more discussion, man, I can't wait to get off Zoom and meet with people in person where, I don't have to wait for people to take off mute, just jump in the conversation. Anyway, let's talk about the reading. Homer Rogers, writing about the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Did we like it? Did we not like it? Do we have questions? I kind of divided it up.
Yeah, that's true.
As you see on the screen. Wait, you're saying half and half, Douglas?
Let Mr. Fisher go first. He's more informed, but
all right, Fisher first. Alphabetical order.
Yeah, sure. Well, that means Mary would go first if we're doing last names.
That is true, but she didn't put her hand up yet. So
yeah. Okay, I'll volunteer. So it was interesting. I think there were some theological things that I was like, really? Like, I think one of his big main points, especially early on, is baptism is 100% a prerequisite to becoming a Christian, and there are no unbaptized Christians, which in a sense I understand where he's coming from, but I think I have a hard time with that. I don't know if that's based on my own church background, and Protestant upbringing, but I think
Because your Protestant friends don't believe in baptism?
they do, but I think there's maybe less emphasis put on, or maybe baptism is a sacrament, which I think the Episcopal Church holds to, and I think that there's maybe less emphasis of like, or there's maybe the emphasis is baptism is not a prerequisite of salvation. And where he's coming from in this article, it sounded like baptism is a requirement for salvation.
Yeah. Or maybe another way to put it might be like your background would say it's the important thing is like a thriving relationship, right? A real relationship with Christ rather than some like kind of formal ceremony or something, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that baptism is literally a sign of the work that Christ has already begun in you.
Yeah.
Now that was maybe before that was maybe the non-denominational side of things, but Presbyterians would also find value in baptizing infants. So
Sure.
I've kind of have a bit of a mix in my background.
Yeah. So if I could just comment very quickly, So Homer Rogers is one of these dyed-in-the-wool Anglo-Catholics, So like in the spectrum of, Protestant to Catholic or low church and high church within the Episcopal Church, he's holding up the high end, which is big on sacraments, big on church tradition, and all of that. And and in that spectrum, you do get a little bit of like with the relationship between like say relationship or ceremony or the relational and the liturgical, right? You do get a little bit of a sense that what's really important is the liturgical or the formal, and your feelings aren't important, or even this idea what there's like I can't think of the Latin term. It's like the sacraments ex opere, like they do what they do apart from how you feel or think about them, which means they but which can tend to be kind of a more mechanical view of things, right? Like, so you're baptized, you're a Christian. You're not baptized, you're not a Christian. And it's a high sacramental view that is trying to emphasize the the importance of the sacramental life, and that they accomplish what they were instituted for. But for me personally, with you, I think there's a little bit you can go a little too far down there. I think sacraments actually are relational. Like marriage is a relationship, but marriage is a sacrament, right? But it's about a living and daily relationship, not a formal piece of paper. Now that's important, right? The ceremony is important, and the promises are important, and the legal realities of marriage are important. But there's also a life to be lived, where you could be married on paper, but it doesn't feel like a marriage, right? So it's the same thing. Like I think with the baptism thing, like, well, technically you're a Christian because you're baptized, but you may not be living as a Christian or thinking like a Christian, right? Or behaving like a Christian or loving like a Christian. So I sympathize to your pause there. Doug, what do you want to say?
The only thing I noticed is when he started kind of waxing nostalgic for serfdom, I was a little surprised, and that was like, well, that kind of I thought went a little bit over. But besides that, yeah.
Yeah, that would be Homer Rogers. It'd be great. Like don't blame me. I voted for King Charles the First, right? I mean,
Exactly.
like
Those were the
back
good old days, you know?
back in the good old days where we knew our place.
Right. We all fit in, the classes, the structures, were everything. Yeah. Okay.
That's a bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Did I read that right?
Yeah, I think you probably did. Mary, do you have any reactions, up or down?
Well, you know, growing up Catholic, it took me back to a lot of the issues I had, just with the rigidity, and I'm finding, as I'm learning to think for myself more, you know, there's a lot of interpretation, and flexibility, and so yeah, I was kind of lukewarm about it.
Got it. So you felt he was rigid. You could tell that he was a little rigid.
Yeah.
Liz, I know you're kind of in the middle of other things there. Anything you want to say about the reading?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was kind of like, oh, sorry. Enjoyed the reading. I didn't agree with everything he said, but I appreciated it. I sort of had to reread a lot of the passages, but in a way too, I want to read more about it. I did think he was rigid. The way he mentioned Criswell a lot, I thought was very interesting.
Yeah.
Criswell, the former First Baptist, yeah. But I kind of want to read more of it. You know, I was just fascinated with what he had to say, whether I agree with it or not.
Yeah. Anyone want to say something positive that they found in the reading?
Well, he's definitely an advocate for the church kind of being a rock in its permanency. To give him that, and that was kind of seemed like the theme he wound up with, his contrast between the Super Bowl and the church, and so I think that could be, you know, considered very positive. But
yeah, there is a reality of there's an institutional reality to the church that it endures, right? And you know, even in that quick 10-minute history, you know, there's a lot of ups and downs there. There's a lot of suffering, you know, the Eastern Church being squeezed by Islam, you know, and so forth, and yet the church goes on, you know. I actually like how he talks about denominations. I mean, we probably would actually disagree at some point, Homer and I, about some of these things, because he will always kind of tend toward the institution, and so he'll be bigger on, like, you know, Anglicanism and Roman Catholicism and the Eastern Church, and he probably has a pretty snooty attitude, as you see, toward like Criswell and Baptist and so forth. But I actually don't mind at all the way he describes, you know, the oneness of the church and how to make sense of denominations, right? Meaning we are all one. We're just behaving like a schizophrenic, you know, or you might even say a family having a family feud, where we are all one. We just don't know it, and we continue to kind of bicker and gripe as if we are our other families, but we're not. I thought that was helpful.
Yeah, I think along those lines, I liked how he discussed how the church transcends time, you know, across generations, and in a sense, well, I didn't necessarily agree with everything he said about, you know, being 2,000 years old and that sort of thing, but I do think there's an element of truth in that, of what the church was doing, the basics and the foundation of the Christian belief 2,000 years ago is the same today, and we're united with those Christians just as they are now united with us. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah, certainly for me, coming from a non-Catholic background, well, really my journey kind of started when, so I actually grew up Lutheran, but then became a Christian when I, kind of understood the gospel and understood Jesus in a Baptist kind of setting. And then I went to college and started to read books. And, in the middle of my college experience, I went to the Holy Land on a study tour, right? And for my Baptist background, you kind of got the sense that, like, the apostles lived and died. And then there was 1800 year like parentheses where, there really weren't Christians who understood Jesus at all until the 20th century. And now, like with a kind of a Baptist or dispensationalist, preaching of the gospel, now the church is kind of back after a hiatus. And so going to the Holy Land and, going to churches that had been there for 1500 years, and praying in those places and understanding that the church is this longer story and wanting to be connected to that story was really important for me, and in that sense, that idea of being Catholic was a remedy to, kind of weird Protestant theology that I was getting in my, high school years, like the idea like the church is going to be raptured or something and Christians are going to disappear at the end of the age and be taken up into heaven. That's really kind of popular Baptist-y kind of stuff, which is not Catholic. I mean, if you look at the church according to the whole, nobody ever taught that, kind of stuff. So for me, finding a home in a Catholic understanding of the church meant you can keep the main thing, be connected to the church throughout history. Well, want to go to the next topic?
Yeah. Could I ask a quick question?
Please.
When did the Bishop of Rome become the Pope? And that would be the significance of it.
February 2nd in the year. No, I'm joking.
So it's simple. It became the church, right?
Yeah. Well, so the thing is, it was a bit of an evolving sort of thing. So it's pretty certain that Peter died in Rome. So there's a sense in which, and under Nero, like the little video said, during that terrible persecution of Nero. So you have Peter in Rome. So you have the leader of the apostles in the capital of the world, right? According to, the Roman Empire. And so the church in Rome has always kind of had this pride of place or this precedence, And so, for that reason, whoever the Bishop of Rome was, has had an important place, as the church had councils, as the Council of Nicaea. Well, I mean, really, the bishops of the major cities in general, were looked to as leaders. So Bishop of Rome, Bishop of Constantinople, Bishop of Antioch, some of these major cities, these were prestigious places. And it's true, like through the history, like when the Bishop of Rome came in and, spoke and it was pleasing to the whole church, they would say things like, Peter has spoken, because that's the successor of Peter. And then you also had some very kind of strong bishops of Rome who, exerted their authority and in a way kind of took it to the next level, and one of them is Leo the First, that he's in the 400s. Another is Gregory the Sixth. We're going to see him in a second here, in the 600s, where, they start to appeal to the idea, like, I am the successor of St. Peter, and that means I have an authority beyond Rome. So there's a sense in which, and through those years between, say 300 and year 1000 or so, you kind of have a situation where various bishops of Rome start to claim more and more authority. And then you have the rest of the church, like, the Bishop of Constantinople or Jerusalem or Alexandria, pushing back, saying, you've always been like a first among equals. You've always, the Bishop of Rome has always been a prestigious position, but has never been like understood to have like universal authority or anything. So the answer to your question, to make it as long as possible, is that, it was an evolving kind of thing through the early Middle Ages, where different bishops of Rome kind of began assuming or claiming, and going to biblical texts, like, well, Peter was obviously in charge, right? Peter is recognized as the head of the apostles. Therefore, whoever is the successor of Peter has the same, rights of authority over the rest of the church. But it was rejected. I mean, and so that, as we saw in that video, 1054, that's where it really comes to a head. That's like where the pimple gets popped. And you have the Bishop of Rome excommunicating the bishops of Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, and those four excommunicating him, both of them saying, we are the one true church. And that's a breach that is still not healed, And then it goes from, it goes on from there. I mean, it's after that then that the Bishop of Rome claims, this like, infallibility and, so it just kind of keeps going from there. Good question. Here's a quick.
I've got one more.
Please.
Just real quick. In the article, he talked about, kind of gave an example about the Friday abstinence. And that's something I'm familiar with in the Catholic Church, but is that, I mean, I know that's probably not globally held within the Episcopal Church, but is that just primarily in Anglo-Catholic churches?
Right. Again, yes, it is. And, so he's in a dyed-in-the-wool Anglo-Catholic parish. So, at St. John's, and actually the church the church I was at for 5 years, very Anglo-Catholic. Yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of a sense that, people shouldn't eat meat on Friday.
All Fridays or during Lent?
Actually, I think all Fridays, especially in Lent. Yeah. So here at St. John's, so I always print a little booklet for Lent where I explain things like fasting and abstinence and giving things up for Lent. And I actually mentioned that, Friday is a day that Christians have observed with special devotion. So that's true. And so in our corporate gathering, so before we were living in a pandemic, we would have a potluck before the Stations of the Cross, or not even a potluck. It would be, one of our ministries would cook a meal. And because it was a corporate, thing, I always said it has to be meatless. And we're not going to serve alcohol or dessert, because those are the things that people give up in Lent, right? So people give up meat, they give up alcohol, they give up chocolate or whatever. And so if we're going to have a corporate activity, we're going to like eliminate those sorts of things. But also realizing it's really up to individuals for what they're going to do, right? So I'm not telling anybody, you have to give up this or the other thing, but just realizing that, well, you should do something, right? But it's between you and God. And so that's kind of how we've rolled with our corporate life a little bit. And the funny thing is too, like people thought I was such a hard ass at the beginning because what was it? The wine. Because I said we will not have wine at our Lenten things, people thought like, this guy is unhinged. This guy is like, he's like, he thinks he's a monk or something, you know, so severe. I'm just like, you know, you don't want to give up wine? Have it when you go home. Some people give up beer or something, you know, and we're not going to like put it under people's noses when they come to church. Anyway, people are funny. I'm funny too. So let's talk quickly about the church in England. The point being this, you know, that we've talked about the via media, the Church of England, the Anglican way. The Episcopal Church is a via media. It's a middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism. And so that's kind of how we understand this, you know, how we are part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That number one, the church got to England quite early. There's actually a legend that Joseph of Arimathea, after the resurrection, brought the Holy Grail to the British Isles. And that's where you get all these Arthurian legends, you know, about, you know, the search for the Holy Grail and things like that. It's because, Joseph of Arimathea, right, who provided the tomb for Christ. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. So you got those English legends. I don't put, I'm not like invested in the legend, but the island of Britain being part of the Roman Empire, right? You got Hadrian's Wall up there and such. It's reasonable to assume that being attached to the Roman Empire, with the roads and traffic and all of that, you know, Christianity got up to England, you know, early on. What we do know, and this was mentioned in the video, is that, you know, in the 200s, the first martyr is mentioned as Saint Alban. He was a soldier. He was actually being prepared for baptism. The Roman soldiers came to arrest the priest of a church. Before the Roman soldiers got there, Alban dressed up in the priest's garb to kind of protect the priest, and he himself was killed. So that's the story of St. Alban. The point being that the church got there early. There were bishops and priests and deacons in the Celtic church. And there on your handout, you see like some of the luminaries, right? There is Patrick of Ireland. We all know him, right? And Bridget, who was kind of his female counterpart. Patrick was actually English, who was abducted by Irish pirates, lived as a slave in Ireland, got freedom, went back to England. I think he became a priest and then went back to Ireland as a missionary. Then there's Columba, there's Aidan of Lindisfarne. He was the monk of a monastery. That's where my son gets his name. And then, so then the interesting thing is you have all these Celtic bishops and stuff, and a life of its own there in the British Isles for, you know, the first 600 years. And then around the year 604, Pope Gregory the Great sends Augustine to the See of Canterbury to make that like the primary bishopric of all of England. So that's where you have Gregory the Great. He's the Pope. So now we're in the union with Rome section. So this is a stained glass of a story that supposedly happened. Gregory he was a monk as well as the Bishop of Rome. He apparently saw these slave children for sale in the streets in Rome, and somebody, you know, he asked somebody, where are these? And they had like this blonde hair, you know, blue eyes, you know, kind of very, I guess, exotic for the dark-haired people in Rome. He said, "Where are these children from?" And somebody said, "They are Angli, they are English." And he apparently said, "They are non-Angli, sed angeli." They are not English, they are angels. Like, he was so taken with, the beauty of the English people, that he determined to send a missionary to the British Isles. And maybe not even knowing, there were already Christians up there. Dang it, there are already bishops, and you got people like Lindis Aden and Cuthbert, and so it's like the Roman Church then sends Augustine to be the archbishop, the Bishop of Canterbury, and part of what he starts to do then is consolidate Christianity under a connection with Rome. So that's where you have on the sheet, you have the Synod of Whitby, 663. And that's where you had representatives of the Roman Church meet with representatives of the Celtic Church, because there were different customs. The big one was, when do you celebrate Easter? And the Romans did it one way based on the sun, and the Celts did it another way based on an idea of when Passover was. So they were celebrating at different times. But really, it was the Synod of Whitby, whereby the Celtic Christians said, we will live under the dictates of Rome. We will be a unified church. And so there was this union with Rome in 663, and I've listed some people there, big shots like Alfred the Great, Anselm of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, William of Ockham, who's a philosopher, Julian of Norwich, a mystic, still read today, John Wycliffe, William Tyndale, and then you come to the Reformation. And we all know about Henry. Thomas Cranmer is the Archbishop of Canterbury. But also, as I think I made the point earlier, there was also a question about, and the video got on this as well, right? There is corruption in the Western Church. And, Luther is protesting the way in which, the Pope is selling indulgences, right? You want to get you want to keep your ancestors from suffering and in purgatory? Well, pay a little money, help us build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and I will release your relatives from purgatory. And Luther and other people in Europe and in England said, and where is that in the Bible, right? That priests or bishop hold us hostage, and what about Jesus dying on the cross for our sins? Has that gotten lost? So you also had theologians and bishops and priests who were looking to reform the English church right around the time Henry VIII wanted an annulment. So in England, the Reformation happened with bishops involved in a way that it didn't happen with the Lutherans or the Calvinists or the Zwinglians in Europe, in that they kind of said, look, we were part of Christ's one holy apostolic Catholic Church since the beginning, right? We've had bishops and priests and deacons, and we've had the sacraments, and we've had everything, even before we united ourselves to Rome in the 600s. And we lived without Rome before, we can live without Rome again. And that was a way of the Reformation going forward, in a way where, the Church of England held this Catholic identity while at the same time being a Protestant church, protesting what the church believed was wrong with the papacy and the Catholic Church. And that then is a brief history of how we got where we are. The next step then would be to say, because the sun never set upon the British Empire, the Church of England spread throughout the world through missionary movement. which was also, tied to the way in which, the English kind of went all over the world with their colonial projects. So, of course, the big one being, going from England here over to these 13 colonies, and then there's a Revolutionary War. And so now you have a Church of England and you have this Episcopal Church in North America. Hard feelings at first, right? Because they had fought a war. But then, kind of getting over that and realizing, they're cousins and they should be a family. And the same thing would be true of like England and Canada, right? Or England and Australia, where they sent all those like criminals to get rid of them. But they're English criminals, and criminals need Jesus too, and a church. So you have these relationships all of a sudden between like the church in England and the church in the United States of America and Canada and Australia. And what developed here is a way of being a church together, not like a papacy where the Archbishop of Canterbury says, like, I'm in charge of you Americans or Australians. No, understanding that we are all national churches with a common heritage and common principles, right? and we recognize one another as being part of Christ's one holy Catholic and apostolic church. Well, then, of course, there's the stuff going on in Africa as well, South Africa, Uganda, Nigeria. There's Nigeria, the big blue one. And it's colonial for a while. There's actually tremendous growth in those churches beginning in the 1900s, really accelerating in the 20th century. Whereby these churches go from being white missionaries to being led and propelled by indigenous leaders, right? So for instance, do you know how many? Take a guess. How many Episcopalians in the American church? Who wants to take a guess of that number?
How many members or how many church members?
Yeah, how many individuals, how many members in the Episcopal Church?
20 million?
I was going to say 25 million.
Oh, that's way more than I would guess.
In the US, it's
I would say-
1,800,000.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Who wants to guess the Church of Nigeria? Right here.
Way more.
Like 40 million?
How many?
40 million?
Oh, see, man, you got such great expectations. Actually, 18 million.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's, 9 times bigger than the church in the US. So all in all, I think 85 million Anglicans in the world, which puts us as number 3 behind Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians. But you see on your handout, there are actually, 39 or 44 different churches, 34 provinces throughout the world. But in terms of the way things, have changed with the spread of Christianity in non-Western places, in the year 1900, 82% of Anglicans were British. And at that time, 5% of Anglicans were American. Now, 55% of Anglicans are living in the African continent, 33 Britain. It's still the national church, right? So, I mean, it's the default. But, the truth is, one interesting, like, on the ground fact would be this. On any given Sunday, there are more Christians in a church in Uganda, just Uganda, not all of Africa, just Uganda. There are more Christians actually in church in Uganda than there are Anglican Christians in church in Great Britain, Canada, the US, and Australia combined. Because Britons are largely nominally Anglican, even with our 2 million members, we're nowhere near 2 million on a Sunday. But the African churches are truly packed. And having been to Uganda a couple times, it's really interesting because on one hand, there's a liturgy like ours, there's some familiar language. And then on the other hand, there's a lot of things not familiar. So no organ, but a whole lot of drums, right? And people dancing and like just getting down like around the altar. And people who don't have money to put in the collection plate, bringing in eggs or avocados or bananas.
Yummy.
And in one case, when we were there, a goat. And they bring all that into the sanctuary around the altar. And what do they do with that? Well, you can't put a goat in the bank, right? So it's like the have-nots bring these things, and then at the end of the service, they auction off that stuff to the haves. So the people who do have money then offer money, and they go home with eggs, and because you can put money in a bank, but you can't put an egg in a bank. Anyway, and the other thing is the church services are usually around 4 hours long because they're not in a hurry to get home to the Cowboy game at all. And this is where their community is, and they would rather dance than be on their iPhones because, you know, the internet's slow over there. So it's a wonderful combination of things. That's what I got today. Any questions? Any final thoughts?
You know, it seems like everyone disappeared.
Oh, I can see everybody.
Okay.
You got the right view on?
Probably not. Are there any? It seems like one advantage the Catholics have is they cross languages really well. You know, there's French and all that, and it seems like that Anglicans are always just kind of predominantly or are English speakers. Are there any Anglicans that aren't like English speakers?
You know, that's a great question. There actually are. I noticed because I was hoping I could find a video about the Anglican Communion. But obviously Anglicans don't have their act together enough to produce one. But I did notice on the Anglican Communion website, they've got videos with like French. I mean, they have lots of videos about other things, you know, initiatives or, you know, relief work or whatever. And some of them actually have French titles. So okay. I'm thinking that like the church in the Congo, for instance, it's going to be primarily in French.
Okay.
Right? And it's probably true in Quebec. You know, they're
Anglicans up there, yeah.
There are Anglican churches in France. There's an Anglican cathedral in Paris that does not rival Notre Dame. So, well, hey, that's what I got. I got to go home and scoop my kid before the next service. He needs to get here to be part of our production team. So I'm going to go.
Quickly, we will be out next week. We're going to be attending baptism for our nephew
In
up in Nebraska. So
all right,
we're going to travel up there.
Yeah, we finally get to see our families.
Yay.
I gotta go see my grandma.
As long as you catch up with the video next week, all right?
Yeah, we sure will.
All right.
Yeah, thanks for recording.
Yep. I should have you guys sign a release because, you know, you're on the internet now.
That's true.
Good to see you guys. Have a great day, all right?
Bye, Father. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.